in Santa Barbara. And I'm looking forward to your talk.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. This has been a really exciting morning so far. All the talks have just been fascinating, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to present to all of you today. So first, I'd like to acknowledge some co-authors and collaborators, my advisor, Frank Zock, beamline scientist Dula, Alistair, and Harold at beamline 8.3.2 up the hill at the Advanced Light Source. And then also interns, Charlene and Richard, and then people from camera that I've worked with, Talita and Danny, and several other collaborators as well. And then acknowledge the funding sources here. So in this talk, I'll be discussing experiments that I've been working on in my PhD on in-situ X-ray computed tomography of high-temperature structural materials. So these structural materials have a number of different applications, ranging from jet engines to nuclear power and rocket materials for the high-temperature components of rockets, with the ultimate goal that we're developing materials for more efficient energy use and energy production. So the application that my group is particularly focused on is on jet engines. Jet engines operate at a higher efficiency when they're operating at a higher temperature. So the ultimate goal is to make the insides of the engines hotter. And the big challenge here is that we need to develop new materials that can operate at these higher temperatures. Current jet engines are using these nickel-based superalloys, which are starting to reach the upper temperature limit. If we heat them up anymore, they're going to start to creep at high temperatures and eventually start to melt. So what we're looking at is developing silicon carbide-based ceramic materials that are tough and that can withstand the environmental conditions. These could give us about a 5% increase in efficiency of jet engines, and also with the weight savings, because they're much less dense than metals, we could also further improve the efficiency of jet engines. So the big challenge with these materials actually happens to just be making them. So 6.6 CMCs are fairly difficult to process. They consist of silicon carbide fibers that are about 12 microns in diameter. And then we want to surround these fibers, these very long fibers, we want to surround them again with a silicon carbide matrix to hold them all together and support them and provide toughness and oxidation resistance. So one promising technique for making these materials is called polymer impregnation and pyrolysis. In this technique, we start off with a fiber bed. These are, from the transverse view, they look like these circles. We flow a pre-ceramic polymer through this fiber bed, and we can then cure and pyrolyze this polymer to convert it to silicon carbide. During the pyrolysis process, the polymer shrinks, and then we end up with a microcrack structure. So over this entire process of impregnation, curing, and pyrolysis, we can form big bubbles, cracks during pyrolysis, and this leads to a very porous matrix. So we then repeat this cycle multiple times, re-infiltrating the polymer into this crack network to further build up this matrix. Typically, in industry, we're achieving about 5 to 15% porosity, but the lower limit that we could really reach would be less than 1%, and this would be ideal. So what we really want is to understand the basic physics of how these defects are evolving and how we might engineer them and control them to make CMCs that can really advance the next generations of engines. So to do this analysis, we're using X-ray computed tomography. Here we capture 3D images of these materials in situ during processing, including both the fluid flow and during pyrolysis. So a data set is shown here, just kind of rotating in 3D of one of the specimens. Fibers are in the vertical direction, and here we have kind of a 2D slices showing what the 2D data looks like through this 3D image. The two different views that we look at most commonly, just for simplicity to look at in 2D, are transverse slices, where we see the fibers as circles, and then longitudinal slices, where we see them as these long rectangular shapes. And the images are fairly large, 2,000 cube to 2,500 cube, and we can collect anywhere from 1 to 100 volumes during a single experiment. And so the goal here is to, from these in-situ X-ray computed tomography experiments, really develop the basic science behind how these materials are made. So an outline for the rest of this talk, I'll be kind of breaking it into two different categories of experiment and also of two different categories for the image processing challenges that we have. So the first, we'll be looking at impregnation and cure. In these specimens, we have kind of the same type of microstructure where we have fibers, matrix, which is kind of a lighter gray, voids, which are darker, and then the specimen boundary. And in all these cases, the matrix is a polymer, And we're interested in looking at where the fibers are, where the voids form, and how all of these features move over time. And then next we'll look at pyrolysis, where the microstructure evolution consists of cracks forming and then growing wider, and the matrix converting from a polymer to a ceramic material. So we'll start off with impregnation and curing. So the overall imaging pipeline is shown here on this line that you can follow. And the first step in the imaging pipeline, it just starts with the experiment. Here we need to optimize the imaging parameters, including the energy that we use, the exposure time, and the number of angles, to give us the best images for the later steps of segmentation, tracking, and simulation. Additionally, depending on what type of experiment we're doing, we'll need to optimize these parameters a bit differently. So for ex-situ experiments, where the specimen is not changing in time and we're just trying to capture a nice image, we can do relatively slow imaging and capture really high-quality images. In-situ imaging, on the other hand, is when we're imaging it as, for example, fluid is flowing through the fiber bed. Here we need to image quickly enough that we can capture the behavior, but not so quickly that our images are not segmentable and we can't see what's going on. So the next step is then to optimize the reconstruction, to remove artifacts, and optimize phase retrieval parameters, which can create very different images, which affects the later stage of segmentation. The next step would be to register the data sets so they can be aligned in 3D, so we can correlate the movement of the features over time. And then finally, segmentation, where we're interested in identifying the fibers, the voids, the matrix, the boundary of the specimen, so that we can measure the properties of each of these features. The next challenge would then be to track each of these features. These specimens contain about 6,000 fibers, and we would ideally like to track each one as it's moving during these processes. And additionally, track the voids as they form and as they move and as they grow and shrink. And then finally, the next stage would be simulation. So we want to develop the physics behind this entire process so we can ultimately engineer and re-optimize it. So in the next several slides, I'll kind of highlight my approach to each of these challenges, but I'm definitely excited to have feedback from all of you on how I can improve on these and develop newer and faster techniques. So the reconstruction segmentation is kind of shown here. The first stage is to reconstruct the 3D volume. And for this analysis, we actually use two different reconstructions depending on what we want to segment. So the reconstruction shown in this column is without phase retrieval, and in the next column is with phase retrieval. The registration is then done between data sets over time using Horn's method and then translating the 3D volume. So then the first step of the segmentation is to identify the fibers. For this, we use the images without phase retrieval, which are shown here, because the edges of the fibers are a lot easier to detect. So we use the circular Hoff transform and then several other filters, including 3D information as well, to kind of filter down and improve the segmentation. The next step would be to identify the boundary, which is done with threshold primarily, and then several other filters to improve that as well. And then finally, to segment the voids, we use the reconstruction with phase retrieval, where the difference between the voids and the matrix is a lot more clear. The voids are these like light gray regions between the fibers, or the voids are the black regions, and the matrix is the lighter gray regions. So after we have this complete segmentation, which has kind of been optimized fairly carefully with several filters and testing of different parameters, then I want to see, is this good enough for the science that we want to do? So the performance metric that I've been using in these segmentations is the error in the saturation that we measure from the 3D images. So the saturation is just the volume of matrix over the total volume of matrix plus voids. And for all of the data sets that we've analyzed, I do one hand-segmented slice, and I found that the maximum error is about 2.2%, which is pretty good for about 100 different volumes that are all large and have varying artifacts across the experiments. So then with these segmentations, the next big challenge that I've been working on is 2D fiber tracking. So our input data here is a binary image of the fibers over time, and the goal would be to have tracking of each fiber with kind of a vector ultimately showing how each fiber has moved so that we can then go in and do simulations of the fluid-solid interactions and explain how these fibers are moving and optimize that behavior. So there are probably several different approaches to this, and the one that I've been taking is to use the Hungarian algorithm to find fiber-fiber pairings that minimize a cost matrix. So the cost matrix that I've developed is based on the distance between the centroids of any two fibers, and then the variation in area. Ideally, a small fiber is still going to be a small fiber later on. And then there's a constant here that I tried varying to see which parameter is more important. So these are the results so far. It's challenging to see up here. But the best results we found are for a value of C equal to 50. And this diagram shows the vectors for every single correlation between the fibers. We find that it's usually about 70 to 80% successful. There are several regions where all of the correlations are correct. However, there are several regions where there are different types of defects. And the two that we've been dealing with are, the first is a chain defect. So in this case, if one fiber is identified wrong, this will just propagate down a line of fibers that are then all incorrect. And then the other challenging regions are turbulent regions, where there's a significant amount of fiber movement, and the algorithm has a hard time tracking those fibers as well. So I have these data sets online, and this is kind of one of the things that I'd be interested in getting feedback on during the sessions in the afternoon. So with all of this data, how are we actually using it to improve the composites processing? So I'll just give a few highlights from the analysis that we've done so far. So the first thing we've looked at is how the fluid flows in the fiber beds and how this influences fiber movement. So this is important because the flow speed through the fiber bed influences the types of bubbles that will form during the impregnation process. And so we want to be able to predict and control this flow speed. And being able to control it depends on being able to predict the permeability. And often the permeability of the fiber bed is very difficult to actually predict because it changes depending on the speed at which you infiltrate the fiber bed. And so we wanted to really figure out why this is happening so we can develop models to improve this process. And what we found is that at really high flow speeds, which are over here, there's a significant amount of fiber movement, which actually increases the permeability of the fiber bed during fluid flow. Whereas at lower flow speeds, the fluid flows preferentially in smaller gaps between the fibers, forming bubbles in the larger gaps. And this actually gives us a lower overall permeability. So with this knowledge, we can now improve our modeling and optimization of this step of the process. We've also used this data to look at mechanisms of void formation during fluid flow. So this plot here shows the saturation before pressure removal and after pressure removal. And we found that there are kind of three different types of behavior that we'll find. When there's no applied pressure, the bubbles form in the larger gaps as the fluid wicks forward in the smaller gaps. And there's no additional bubble formation. There's no pressure removal in this step. At very high pressures, all of the bubbles actually get pushed out during the fluid flow. And so when we remove the pressure, there's also no change in the saturation. However, in this intermediate range, which is what we want to avoid, we form some bubbles during fluid flow. They then get trapped and compressed. And when we remove the pressure, a bunch of new bubbles form in the specimen, which are shown here in red. And the old bubbles that were there before pressure removal are shown in green. So we use these images to kind of understand where the bubbles are forming and why they might form in these regions during this process. The third thing that we've looked at is quantifying the microstructure evolution during the cure process. So during curing, the polymer releases a bunch of gas, and this gas needs to escape. So often what we actually find is that the specimens that performed really well in the last step and had a really high saturation have the largest drop in saturation during curing because they need to form bubbles for the gas to escape. And this is a problem because when these really big bubbles form, they actually cause a significant amount of fiber movement, which is shown here with this red void, pushes a bunch of fibers out of the way. And the bigger the bubbles that form, the more non-uniformity we find in the fiber bed later, which is a problem in later processes of this, or later steps in this process. So with all of this information about void formation, fiber movement, we can start to optimize this process to have the highest saturation while also having the smallest void sizes, while also having the most uniform fiber bed, which is optimal for later stages. So with that, I'll now move into the pyrolysis experiments, where here we're looking at a specimen over time as it's being heated up and the polymer converts to ceramic. So the imaging pipeline here is fairly similar to the last one, but there are a few different steps for what we want to get from this data. So first, again, we optimize the XCT experiment. We want to image quickly enough to see the cracks forming, but not too quickly that the image is too low quality. Then reconstruct the data, and then segment the fibers, the matrix, the cracks, and the bubbles, and the specimen boundary. So with all of these different features, we can identify what types of cracks are forming, because this is not known before. No one's ever looked at these types of materials in this process before, and so we just want to see what are the crack geometries, when do the cracks form. So we've kind of developed a framework of a bunch of different geometries that form. So the next thing that we want to do is classify each of these, ideally automatically. So once the crack forms, we want to say, was this a crack or was this a bubble that was there before? And then what type of crack is it? The next step would be then to track these cracks over time so that we can track their initiation temperature and then track new cracks that form near the older cracks separately from the cracks that had formed before. And then finally do a 3D network analysis with the ultimate goal of optimizing and understanding how fluid would flow through this crack network in the next stage of processing. And then finally, simulations so that we can predict and optimize this process, where we want to understand the fracture mechanics, be able to predict what type of crack network we're going to have, and then understand how fluid will flow through it, where bubbles will form, and what type of cracks we want to optimize for in later stages. So all of the analysis on this data so far has been fairly manual. We're trying to just understand what's going on and develop a framework for how we want to do these later stages of the analysis. So I'll just go over some of our results there so far. Okay, so our first finding is that primary cracks, and these are the first cracks to form in any given region of matrix, fall into two different categories. So the first type of primary crack is what I've called a perimeral crack, and so I'll show you that in this video, which will show cracks forming over time, and the cracks are colored by the temperature at which they form. So first, to kind of orient you, these blue cylinders are all of the fibers surrounding this region of matrix. This is a relatively large region between the fibers. So then the first crack to form is what I've called a perimeral crack. These cracks are primarily perpendicular to the fibers. However, they often initiate at a fiber matrix interface, where they then travel along that interface and then kink into the matrix and spread out. At higher temperatures, these longitudinal cracks will then form. And then at even higher temperatures, we see the formation of what we've called semi-perimeral cracks, which are also perpendicular to the fibers, but only span a part of this region of matrix. And then finally, we might see the formation of interfacial cracks at even higher temperatures. So this is just kind of showing these 3D renderings at increasing temperature, showing the four different types of crack geometries we've identified within this perimeral family. And 2D sections showing this crack evolution are shown here on the right, to kind of illustrate how we identify the crack geometry and how we identify the initiation temperature based on very skinny regions that appear. So we basically look for the image at the lowest temperature where we can actually see the crack to determine the initiation temperature. So the second crack family has a different type of primary crack. These are kind of alternating or wavy in nature. So again, kind of first orienting you to the fiber region. This is a relatively small region of matrix between the fibers. So the first crack to form in this region is an alternating crack. So these initiate at the interface, and then they actually propagate back and forth kind of along the fibers. And then at higher temperatures, we can see these semi-perimeral cracks branching off of this alternating crack, and then at even higher temperatures, these interfacial cracks. So again, 3D renderings with increasing temperature are shown here, along with their corresponding 2D slices, where you can see this crack as it formed and then grew wider and formed new cracks nearby in the same region. So I'd also like to point out that these types of cracks, compared to the perimeral cracks we saw before, are expected to be very favorable because they're inherently connected along their length. So if we want to flow fluid through this region in the later processing steps, this type of crack would be more likely to flow fluid all the way through the composite. So now that we know what types of cracks are forming, we want to understand the fracture mechanics so we can predict and control the 3D crack structures. So to study the crack evolution, we've looked at the initiation temperature and kind of the size of the matrix region, which is characterized by its transverse area. So our first finding is that cracks that form in larger regions tend to form at lower temperatures, and also that alternating and wavy cracks tend to form in smaller regions. So for this case, we might actually want to optimize the fiber architecture to have smaller gaps between the fibers, which, as we saw before, is influenced by the behavior during impregnation and curing. Our other finding has to do with the final crack structure after the completion of pyrolysis. So what we've defined is this final hierarchical order, which depends on the number of different crack types in that region after the completion of pyrolysis. So this one, which is a fairly large crack, has several other semi-perimeral and interfacial cracks. So this has a FHO of 3, whereas these much smaller regions tend to have a lower final hierarchical order with just this one wavy crack. So we find that typically the larger regions have a much higher final hierarchical order. And we see the same trend in the perimeral family of cracks. So this further helps us develop models and understand the fracture mechanics. We've also looked at the spacing between the cracks. For the alternating cracks, looking at the half wavelength, and for the perimeral cracks, looking at the spacing. And I found that the spacing also increases with the size of the region. So this also helps us predict more about this 3D crack network that we ultimately want to model fluid flow through. So in summary, we've looked at in-situ XCT experiments from impregnation and cure, where we looked at fiber movement, preferred flow channeling, and have been able to develop some insights that will help us improve permeability, impregnation, and curing models. And some collaborative interests that I have for the future would be to track the fibers in the voids and do CFD in these fiber beds to understand the fiber movement and bubble formation. We also looked at pyrolysis, where we've developed a taxonomy of different crack structures and crack geometries, and started to look at the effects of the processing on what types of cracks will form. So in the future, what I'd like to do, kind of in collaboration, would be to automate all of this analysis, be able to segment, identify these cracks, and predict when they'll form, and then do 3D network analysis, and ultimately simulation in these 3D networks. So these data sets are also available in the link next to my name. So thank you all for your attention, and I'll take any questions.
Questions?
Excellent talk. I always learn something new in your talk, Natalie, so thank you so much for sharing that with us. Also repeating that the data, a lot of the data that she showed today is available in the program under samples next to Natalie Larson, so check it out. You get the chance to play around with these data sets. It's not my surprise that you got the award last year, the Neville Smith Award, so congratulations, great work. I'm curious about the first work that you showed, where you're actually tracking these cross-sections. So what's the correspondent of a cross-section in time, in one frame to the other frame, since there are a lot of things happening, and probably, the dilation of these fibers and whatnot. The correspondence is not immediate, since you're doing the cross-section, not exactly, it can be the case that it's not exactly the same cross-section. How much did that actually influence the results?
So you're referring to the registration of the data sets
That's
in 3D? So that was actually a bit challenging. I tried to do an automatic registration, but because the fibers are moving and voids are forming, it really wasn't working very well. So any tips on how to make it automatic would be great. But what I ended up doing was finding points in the 3D volumes that actually correlated because I knew they weren't moving. So for example, these could be fibers that are embedded in the glass tube along the edge. Those tend to not move. There might also be bubbles in the glass tube, and those aren't going to move. And so what I did for each data set that I needed to register was I selected several points in 3D manually, and then used Horn's algorithm to calculate the transformation matrix and then applied that transformation matrix to actually match them all up. And this worked really well. It was a bit time consuming to manually collect those data points, but then after that, the algorithm worked quickly and was able to get a spot-on registration, and then from that, I can then hopefully do the tracking now that I know how they're aligned.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Let's thank the speaker again.